Earlier this year, we did an Intel versus AMD video. In that video, we crowned Intel the champion. Is that still the case? Let's talk about it. In the previous video, as we mentioned before, the AMD platform is still highly recommended for certain circumstances, depending on the game you're playing, depending on the use for it as well. Also, at the time, the prices were a little bit higher on the AMD platform. Now they've come down a lot, so obviously that does change the factor of what we would recommend. Also, at the time, we recommended Intel over AMD, especially the i7. It was kind of that the balance. We also recommended the i9, but as time has gone on, we've actually noticed a big jump in issues with the 13th gen and the 14th gen platform. That's something else we'll talk about more in this video. Let's pick up where we started in the last video, pros and cons, starting with AMD. All right, starting with AMD, like I recommended before, the X3D series has always been a really good platform, starting with the 7800X3D, the 7900X3D, and the 7950X3D. Now, recommendation-wise, we still recommend the 7800X3D in that platform. If you need a non-X3D CPU, we only recommend those for like content creators, video editors, just because the other cores don't get disabled and there's a lot less issues when it comes to Windows. So if you're a content creator, straight up just editing, doing a lot of content, filming, the non-X3D version is something that we would recommend. So that's where the 7900X and the 7950X3D are still highly recommended. Now, if you're looking for straight performance, that's where the X3D platform comes into play. That's the main reason why in our Power series, starting with the Power Prestige all the way to the Power Elite, we have the AMD Ryzen 7800X3D. It's one of the biggest questions we get all the time. Why don't you guys have the 7950X3D and the Power Elite? Well, the main reason for that is, again, this CPU literally performs the same as the 7950X3D, obviously with a lot less having to tinker with Windows for it to work correctly. If you want more information on that, if you look it up, you'll see it. This is just straight out of the box. It works and it has a lot less issues. Also with the AMD platform, a really big pro is obviously TDP is a lot lower than Intel. That reduces the temperature as well, so you don't need something crazy for cooling purposes. It helps out with the overall PC itself as well. You don't need a high-end power supply. You don't need a high wattage power supply. We still recommend to always get something a little beefier because power supply is definitely one of those ones that we recommend at least a 250 TDP over what the whole system is required, essentially. But with the AMD platform, the good thing is the wattage is not a big factor. And again, that reduces temperatures. We also have the AMD 9000 series as well here in-house. Later on in this video, we're gonna be showing you the AMD Ryzen 9700X against its counterpart, the i7 14700K. Some more base level stats like the TDP and the temperature, but we'll get into that later. Now let's talk about the pros for Intel. Moving into the Intel series, like I mentioned earlier, the i5, the i7, and the i9 are still really good choices for gaming itself. Also for multitasking is a really big plus. The i9 definitely still takes the cake when it comes to multitasking. So if you're video editing, rendering, even multitasking on one PC with OBS and so on and so forth, this definitely helps out tremendously. Still, my personal favorite from Intel is definitely the i7 14700K. It kind of gives you that balance, core count, threads, per core performance. It competes very heavily with the AMD Ryzen 7800X3D and at the very similar price point. So price point between the two are very close. Again, with Intel, the pros is obviously everything just works right out of the box. There's a lot less finicky issues in comparison to the AMD platform. When it moves into the i5 series, again, good price point, good performance. Again, core counts are there as well. E-cores, P-cores, so that does help out with a lot of rendering times, editing. So if you're looking at any type of video editing, Intel still kind of takes the cake on that side. And again, we're talking small amounts of difference in timing. We're not talking hours of difference in rendering. We're talking a few seconds to a few minutes at most. So nothing too crazy. But again, out of these three, I would personally recommend the i7 14700K. Now that we wrapped up the pros, let's talk about the cons. Starting for the cons for AMD. With AMD, there's actually not too many cons. The only thing that we've gotten complaints about is the boot up time. It does take a little bit longer to boot up in comparison to the Intel platform. It kind of does like a whole memory controller thing when you're booting up, but there is actually a simple fix for that in the BIOS, so it does help with the boot up times on that end. Also, these are limited to wattage, to TDP with AMD, but again, this is a simple fix. In the BIOS, there's a thing called PBO, which is called Precision Boost Overdrive. So if you do have an AMD CPU and you do enable this, just keep in mind, warning, you will be unlocking the TDP, so it actually goes past the AMD default recommended, but it does give you a good performance and boost. So again, the con behind it, again, is that it could degrade your CPU a little bit faster, so I don't recommend it entirely. If you're okay with the default settings, just stick with that. Now for the Intel cons. Starting with the i5, honestly, there's not too many cons when it comes to the CPU itself. I could probably say the con would be the price point. I do wish it was a little bit lower in price, maybe closer to $279-ish range. Because in the AMD side, again, the AMD 7700X performs very similar, and the price is a little bit lower by about $30. And that's with the newest price adjustment from Intel and AMD. Moving over to the i7, again, that would be pretty much my only con. Same thing, price point. I guess I wish it was a little bit more comparable to the 7800X 3D. Again, it's by $30-40. It's a little bit more expensive than the AMD side in comparison. So those two would pretty much be the only cons I have for the i5 and the i7. Now, moving into the i9, this is where we've seen a lot of changes in the past few months since we did our last video. We did mention the problems that Intel was having back on our last video, but things have gotten a whole lot worse. A lot more people have been reporting the issues that they've been having. There was a lot of issues with board manufacturers pretty much releasing new BIOS updates. It's putting pretty much everything at Intel defaults. So you are losing some performance. One of the biggest cons for this whole new problem that Intel's been having with the 13 and 14 Gen i9s is with the latest BIOS, especially one that's coming out here soon. It's pretty much downclocking the CPU to the point where it's performing the same as an i7. And to me personally, that is a very big con. You're paying $599 for the CPU, while the i7 is closer to the $399 price point. And now you're pretty much downclocking this to an i7 performance. Obviously you have the extra 2 cores and the extra threads, which does help out with render times. But again, we're not talking about hours of waiting. We're still talking about a few seconds to maybe a few minutes. So that's where out of these three, the i7 is still the better bet. There has been reports of the i7 having the same issues as the 13 Gen i9 and the 14 Gen, but it's so minuscule. Like in our own testing, we've not had any issues at all with the i5 or i7 in compared to the i9. There has been reports of the i7, but it's been like one-offs or like 1 or 2. It's been very little to the point where we don't even consider it really to be a problem. Us personally, like I said, we haven't had any issues with these two. Mainly it's been the i9. So we have about 30 CPUs sitting here pretty much from Intel we have to replace to get the newer ones, because once the degradation kicks in, it pretty much destroys the CPU out at that point. Once you have it for so long, it continues to have that continuous bad cycle of crashing games. Over time, it just pretty much destroys the CPU, and you pretty much have to RMA and get a new one from Intel, and it can happen again. So that's where Intel now is releasing this new BIOS here coming in the next few weeks. It's going to pretty much put everything at Intel defaults. So for now, in good conscience, I personally cannot recommend the i9. I can recommend the i7 and the i5 easily. Again, we had no issue with those two. If you do buy an i9 build from PowerGPU, we will have everything pre-configured in the BIOS to help that degradation over time. And also keep in mind, you will still have a warranty with PowerGPU and Intel, so if something does happen, we will take care of the problem for you as well. But like I said, in good faith, I do not recommend the i9. When it comes to the Intel family, I still recommend the i7 and the i5. Now let's hop into the warehouse and show you those comparisons against the 9700X and the 14700K. All right, Vincent, what are we testing here today?
So we got the 9950X 3D from AMD. It hasn't even
Wait,
been
hold
announced.
on. All right, I don't know what happened to Vincent, but we're actually going to be testing the i5 14600K, the i7 14700K, and the AMD Ryzen 7 9700X on line pack and CPU tests on OCCT. All right, so let me show you what we're actually looking for in these tests. With the i7, you can see here the temperature, 100 Celsius, 300 watts TDP, and usage, again, 100%. On the i5, same thing, 91 Celsius, very close to the 100 Celsius above, with a 210 watt TDP. Now, if you come over here to the 9700X, you can see it's only at 54 Celsius with a TDP of 807 watts, which is kind of crazy. Now, keep in mind, this is with PBO disabled, so if we enable PBO, this will shoot up to about 150 watts at most, so still under the i5 14600K and the i7 as well. Now let's talk about our overall thoughts on AMD and Intel. So as you guys saw, it's a pretty big difference with the 9000 series from AMD. The TDP is much lower, the wattage is much lower, and what's crazy is the single core boost as well on the 9000 series is actually outperforming all the Intel platforms, including the i9. So I can't wait to show you the end results, the actual performance between these 9000 series CPUs versus the Intel CPUs. Now, you guys are wondering which one I think is the champ between the Intel and AMD platform. For me, there's gonna be a new champion to be crowned here, and I'm definitely gonna recommend the AMD Ryzen 7800X 3D. When it comes to the 9000 series, I would also recommend those as well, but we still gotta do a little bit more testing. Like I said, that video will be next week. There I can give you more of a recommendation level. If you do decide to go with Intel, I would still recommend the i7-14700K. That would be the closest performance to the 7800X 3D and the closest to the price performance as well. You'll have very limited issues in compared to the i9, as we have had no issues in-house with the i7. That's something we'd recommend from Intel. And that's it, AMD wins.